To discuss the very exciting but also very complex field of oncology, we welcome Carlos, whose company in Sweden is developing cell-based therapies against cancer. We have Masoud, who comes from the US. His company develops small molecules in the immuno-oncology field. And we also have Holger, who is on the board of several immuno-oncology companies and can bring an investor's perspective to the topic. So, talking about oncology, the number of companies seems to be booming. We don't stop hearing about new approaches, promising results, but also about failure in clinical trials. So to start with, Masoud, of all this avalanche of things that are happening right now, what are the major trends you see in the field?
Sure, thank you, Clara. So I think right now we're really at what I would say is a second revolution in cancer therapy, which surprisingly, in my opinion, is not necessarily driven by revolution in technology, but really a revolution in perspective and how we look at cancer. So maybe before I talk about the most exciting emerging technologies in the second revolution, it makes sense to just briefly talk about the first revolution in cancer therapy, and that began really in the 70s that was technology driven. So the invention of PCR and cloning really led to our ability to look at tumor cells themselves, find out how they're different than normal cells by doing sequencing and finding mutations, and then making targeted therapies against the cancer cells themselves with the idea that if we kill the cancer cell or stop it from dividing, we're going to get some therapeutic benefit. And that's what we've been doing over the last 20 years or so with some benefit. So what happens when you have advanced stage cancer and you get one of these targeted therapies? Well, you generally have a very good response. Your tumor will shrink generally, depending on the therapy, but almost invariably you'll get resistance, your tumor will come back, and you'll have to get on another line of therapy. And so this is the case with most patients with advanced disease, which was the reason maybe until 10 years ago the rate of death from metastatic disease had not changed over the last 30 years despite advances. So I think right now we're on the frontier of a change in perspective and how we think about cancer. We've moved from this idea that thinking about a tumor in isolation to thinking about cancer as a process that involves not just the tumor, but the host, in this case, the body and all its different organs. And we heard from Dave about a lot of the interesting technologies involving the microbiome, for example, thinking holistically about how the microbiome interacts with the immune system. And I think our perspective now, thinking about cancer progression as a systemic disorder that involves not only dysfunction in the body, in the tumor, but in the body as well. And most importantly, in the tumor microenvironment, where we have, for example, the immune system interacting with the tumor. We have cells in the body's organs interacting with the tumor. And I think the second revolution is really driven by this idea that we need to interact and address and target the body as well as the tumor. And the best example of this is cancer immunotherapy. And I think this second revolution is really driven by advances in cancer immunotherapy for the most part, but other therapies that hit the microbiome, the microenvironment. And this has led to patients with advanced disease, the ones I mentioned before, actually, for all intents and purposes, being cured of their cancer. And we have examples of that. Patients from 10 years ago getting ipilimumab, the first approved immunotherapy, that at stage 4 melanoma, now with no detectable disease, after having stopped taking the therapy. So I think the most exciting things from my perspective are novel approaches at hitting the tumor microenvironment, the immune system, and kind of this next wave of technologies. Yeah.
Okay. So with all this going on, we're certainly advancing, but of course, as we discover new things, there's also lots of challenges arising, and not only challenges, but opportunities from those challenges. Which are the ones you would highlight?
From an investor's perspective, I think just a bit of a history where probably the largest investor in BioVax, in early days, the first oncolytic virus, which was sold to Amgen in 2011, and we are currently invested in 3 other IO companies. From our perspective, there is a bunch of new opportunities in a variety of small startups. But as you said, I think the cancer landscape has changed very much on whatever you look for, perspective in the preclinical setting, you have new models, but also how to do a clinical trial is changing every day. So the challenge for a small startup company is they have probably identified, let's say, a new checkpoint, a target where they develop inhibitor or something which target the microenvironment of the tumor. They need to predict a bit the future. How should my clinical trial look like in, let me say, plus 3 or 4 years? And I think it's very difficult now to really foresee that. So we are looking for, in these new companies, how they can properly differentiate and have their position in an ever-changing landscape in oncology. And as you were saying, there's also new diagnostic tools coming up. The cancer entities are segregating, so you have several subtypes of, look at lung cancer. Yeah, it started with probably 1 or 2. Now you have genetic different type of lung cancer with specific targeted therapies. So the challenge is to have a plan for a startup company to more or less adopt your preclinical and clinical strategy to get your product positioned very competitively in an environment you, as I said, you can barely foresee. As a consequence, you need, and this is my estimate currently, you need at least 30 million euro in Europe if you want to pursue a compound against one of these new IO targets to a kind of clinical proof of concept. So we are building our companies around, or assets and companies around this concept, to get the company financed to this clinical proof of concept.
I think one of the, or a couple of the biggest challenges today for biotech in the space of the immuno-oncology, we talked to the fast pace of development, and I think the challenge for us, and we are in the cell-based therapy. We have a Rgenix product that is off the shelf, so, and it's that the authorities are not basically operating at the same speed. So these days, we face, for instance, a lot of much longer time for reviews by the health authorities, when they look at cell-based therapies. It's still being, debated a lot, what are going to be the regulatory pathways. So, it's being constructed at the moment, really, what is going to be required to approve cell-based products, debating about, fast processes to bring products to the market. So this is one of the challenges that we face as a cell-based therapy. And although we are originated from healthy donors, it's still a lot of requirements in terms of the number, in the specifications that we need to deliver as a company. And, for instance, we got our CTA approved to initiate studies in France just in February, where we are already running studies in all over Europe. And this is the big differences between the countries of looking at products based in cell-based therapy. So of course, for a biotech, where we plan and design your clinical trials, one of the challenges, what is going to be, your comparator, what's going to be the design, is then also, what is going to be required by the health authorities just for you to run your study. We are not talking about approval. And this is one of the key challenges we face as a company, and for all biotechs operating in the very innovative field.
But I think the good news for biotech companies in IO is that, in my opinion, for the next 5, probably 10 years, there will still be a huge demand from the pharma industry for new targets and new compounds. So there is a lot of reason, if you have a scientific, brilliant idea or finding, to pursue this. Yeah,
I agree with Carlos, too, that one of the main challenges is with all this opportunity, new targets, new approaches, and this idea that we're starting to think of cancer, I think, more like HIV, where initially you give single treatments with very little response. Now patients with HIV can live almost a full life expectancy by rational combination approaches, that we not only have new targets, we have targets that we have to combine with other drugs with effective clinical development strategies to get patients to cures. And I think there's a tremendous pressure not only on the field, but on the regulatory agencies to be able to adapt to that. And without the benefit of the HIV field, for example, where clinical trials can be very short, we have to run long clinical trials in oncology. It can be 3, 4, 5 years. And so I think the solution to this really lies in rational combination and clinical strategies, which should be really based on strong biological principles. And we have a lot of clinical trials now being done that may not have that rationale. And I think over the next 2, 3 years, we're going to start to see the real winners in the combination immuno-oncology space and the losers, which are likely based on poor rational combination approaches. So I think that's a major challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, Holger mentioned that already. It's one of the other big challenges, regardless of whatever technology or approach you have, is that regardless of that, you need patients to run your clinical trials. Just in the US, there are currently, in the space of oncology, 800 trials run, 500 of which are in immuno-oncology. So if you think about the challenge of deciding and defining what are the type of tumors and the type of combinations that you are going to run as a company, and use your very tight budget, it's another one of the big challenges that companies are facing today in this very innovative field. In addition to the fact that, in 1 year time, the changes are enormous. You can start designing your study, and in 12 months, then you need to rethink it, because your competitor, there was some new data, ASCO just now, last week, you start getting new data, and the things change from month to month.
And then you also need to consider, if you think of combination, I think the prominentest product is Keytruda. This costs you either partner with MSD or you pay for it as a company, so 3 million at least for your clinical trial. But then if you combine it with your own antibody, you have 2 antibodies, and you need to consider the healthcare cost then at the end. So maybe some IO companies should maybe look for small molecules, which is probably a little bit more difficult to develop. So the cost part of the IO for the society is also to be considered to make it even more complex.
Yeah, and I think that these challenges will actually force biotech companies, investors, and pharma to think very carefully about how they're going to pursue combination immuno-oncology trials. We've been through a period of maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years where maybe there wasn't as much focus because of maybe an overabundance of resources, particularly on the large pharma side. But if you're a biotech company, and I agree, you need at least $30 million to run these clinical trials, you have to think very carefully, and you have to really base the decisions on rational trial design and the science, which is ever changing. But I think in some ways that should be looked at as a good thing, because you don't want to have a limited number of patients exposed to combinations or treatments that aren't going to benefit them. And my feeling is that if you develop a therapy with real benefit to patients, providers and payers will pay for that therapy. That's been borne out historically, and I think that's how we look at it as a company, and that also brings the focus on making rational trial design. If you're going to make a therapy that costs $150,000 a year, that's an incremental benefit of 1 or 2 months to patients, that's just, my feeling is that in 2, 3, 4 years, that's going to be difficult to push that therapy, and payers are not going to be willing to pay for that.
So before we let the public take some questions, I was wondering, since we have representatives from Europe and also the US today, could you comment a bit on how the field is different between the US and Europe at the moment?
I can speak mostly from the U.S. Side, and I'll let my colleagues speak mostly in Europe. But I think in terms of on the business side and in the oncology space, I think in the U.S. we are fortunate to have the benefit of a lot of venture capital going to a lot of promising biotechs with enough capital to get through proof of concept, which again is in the $30 to $50 million range. Maybe in Europe that's happening less, and I think the difference, there's very strong science, basic science, clinical science in Europe. There is capital in Europe. There's superb clinical sites to do trials. I think in the US, one reason we have a major advantage is because historically over the last 30 years, we've had a geographic focused ecospheres, mostly in Boston and in San Francisco, and maybe now moving into New York, which allows investors, biotech, clinical sites, and scientists to come together, work together over multiple projects and get comfortable with each other. So I think one of the main differences as I look towards Europe and hear from my European colleagues about the challenges is really because it's more decentralized. It's more difficult to have this localized ecosystem, which I think facilitates drug development. So from a practical biotech business development perspective, I see that as maybe one of the advantages we have in the US, because from a science perspective and everything else, even running trials, for example, in Eastern Europe can be much more rapid than what would accrue in the US. But in the US, we have more trials, obviously, running in oncology. So.
Yeah, I think, in terms of the science, you have very good science on both sides. It's clear that you have more money available, in the US. That makes it easy for startups to get private money. And I think it's one of the differences when you look at European companies and US companies in the space is that you end up having more public companies in Europe just because the availability of money through investors is less, so they tend to go more to the public markets. But I think one of the differences on a practical aspect, and you mentioned that, is the cost of the drugs in your combinations, checkpoint inhibitors, where, for instance, in the US, you have a lot of checkpoint inhibitors that are now approved and as standard of care. So it makes it a little bit easier financially to run studies in the US versus in Europe, where in very few countries you have checkpoint inhibitors approved as standard of care. So that makes it very challenging to run some of these studies in Europe because, as you said, it's quite expensive to pay for these products. These are more practical things, but there are some of the differences in terms of the space, in terms of what you have approved and perceived now and reimbursed as standard of care between US and Europe.
I think from the investor's perspective, I just tell you a story. We are investing in IO for a couple of years, and the scientific foundation in Europe is strong because we feel that we learned that because we have lost deals to US companies. So we were very close to a new foundation of people having great ideas in T-cell therapy, which was acquired by Kite. Then we lost another company which was acquired by Aduro. And then there's a German smaller company I was aware of but didn't follow, which was acquired by Juno. So I think we have a lot of opportunities, and not to say something bad about my own community, but I think the venture capitalists in Europe, they have been a little bit shy and maybe also risk averse. Of course, also there was probably not enough money in the funds available. So we have really lost very exciting IO opportunities in Europe over the last 5 years. But there's still interesting deals available. So I think encouraging science, encouraging findings, and also an awareness of the pharmaceutical companies that there's a lot of going on in Europe.
Thanks a lot. We will be taking questions from the public now.
Hi, I'm Catherine Featherston from APM Health Europe. We've heard from the panel that one of the problems biotech faces is that the authorities can't keep up. Regulators just can't keep up with the pace. I wondered if you could talk about the implications of the recent FDA decision to approve Keytruda based on biomarkers instead of on a specific part of the body for cancer, and what implications that has for the R&D process, particularly data and the requirements for authorization.
I can speak to that. So the example given generally in oncology and actually almost exclusively, there's been approvals for certain types of cancers based on their place of origin. So brain cancer, lung cancer, breast cancer, one treatment gets approval in that indication. The trial is run there. There's a recent approval for a checkpoint inhibitor called Keytruda that is across essentially an unlimited number of malignancies based on the type of genetic defect that those types of cancers have, regardless of where they come from. So you could have a lung cancer, breast cancer, et cetera, approved in a small number of cases. And I think that's moving in the right direction. I think the regulatory agencies are, in that case, made a favorable decision. But I think that the onus is on biotech and pharma to provide the data to allow the regulatory authorities to make that decision. Is it safe? Is it going to be effective? So we have to work with them as partners to really provide the type of information and data that will allow for that type of approval to occur. We can't expect the regulatory agencies to, in the reverse direction, come to us and say, well, this data looks good. Why don't we have an approval for this? And I think that's one of the challenges that we face. It's what they call a chicken and egg problem, right? You need to pay a lot of money to do these trials, and if there's some doubt about getting the approval on the tail end, then there's going to be less enthusiasm to do that. But as the data in oncology and the results from these oncology trials is looking better and better in certain indications, with again rational decisions on which patients to treat, we're going to see a lot more of this, and this is part of the revolution, I think, in treatment.
Yeah, I think one of the, it's true that, as I mentioned, the authorities are trying to catch up. But on the other hand, what is also very positive is that they are now very eager to enter into dialogue and to really, in this very innovation fields, to try to understand and catch up as much as possible. So one of the things that, any company should do is to initiate very early dialogues with the regulatory authorities. The more innovative is your field, and again, we are operating in that field. We are finding that in reality the authorities are very open to talk about it, to discuss it, to find ways of streamlining the process. There's a lot of engagement between authorities and companies in defining even the guidelines, because again, it's exploring new fields, new areas. So that is quite positive. So it's not like you see like in the past, more a resistance type of behavior. It's more, it's changing so much that basically the authorities understand that they need to work with the biotechs. And so the biotech and pharma need to then enter into that dialogue. And I think it's probably more challenging for the big pharma to be a little bit more transparent and open, in sharing the data, because ultimately what everybody has a benefit is that it needs to be safe for the patients, It has to make a huge impact in terms of a clinical benefit, definitely, because otherwise you are not going to get reimbursements, but needs to be safe. And that is the main concern. But we see that from national authorities to MEA and the FDA, there's a lot of openness of trying to find, more a solution based, let's find solutions, solve problems, then, this is a barrier.
Are there any more questions? Yep, please.
Victoria English from Midnaus. I wanted to ask Holger, how do you energize your limited partners? You were talking about risk averse.
I think You know, we have a history with BioVax where we, I think, had also difficult times because BioVax need to be refinanced in the 2008-9 timeframe when no money at all was available for a company in, you know, oncolytic virus was a kind of vision idea, no proof at all. So luckily we had been able to raise, I think it was a $70 million series, I don't know, F or E or D round, which finally generated the necessary data to get Amgen on the table to acquire the company. And I think if you have run through such type of, you know, good time, bad times pattern in a partnership, and you are in contact with the potential acquirer, you also get more insights about what is the acquirer's landscape, what's going on the pharma side, and this has brought us into looking more intensively into this. And then another interesting step, we hired in 2013, we hired an analyst from the Netherlands Cancer Institute who did his PhD in oncology, and he is our internal, let me say, whiz he sees everything we see in oncology. So we have one brain. He's also going on conferences and giving us a kind of benchmarking for all the deals we see. And then we invested, as you know, in Rgenix, in the innate immune system, and we have another startup in Germany, which is not yet disclosed, where we started a company from the scratch with a completely new approach to make cold tumors hot. So I think we putting our bets, but we do this by knowing intimately what the pharma side is looking for.
Anyone else? Questions? So yeah, we're almost out of time, so I'm just gonna thank you for your time. And